How Khalid ibn al-Walid broke Roman fortresses without siege engines. Imagine you're a Roman commander. You're standing on the walls of one of the most fortified cities in the ancient world. You've got thick stone walls, towers, archers, crossbowmen, supplies that could last you months, maybe years. You've faced armies before. You've seen invasions before. You know how war works. If an enemy wants to take your city, they need siege towers, battering rams, catapults, and time, lots of time. And you have all the time in the world. Then you look out from your walls, and what you see makes no sense. There are no siege engines. There are no towers being constructed. There are no massive war machines creaking toward your gates. There's just an army, a relatively small one by Roman standards, and at the front of it is a man on a horse who looks like he has absolutely no intention of waiting. His name is Khalid ibn al-Walid, and before this is over, your fortress is going to fall. Welcome back to From Start to Now. Today we're diving deep into one of the most fascinating and underappreciated military stories in human history. We're talking about how a general, some would say, the greatest battlefield commander who ever lived, cracked open Roman fortresses without the tools that everyone believed were required to do it. No siege towers, no catapults, no battering rams worth mentioning. Just strategy, psychology, speed, and a mind that worked in ways his enemies simply couldn't predict. If you're new here, welcome. We do exactly what the name says. We start from the very beginning and take you all the way through. Hit subscribe, because this story, once you understand all of it, is going to completely change how you think about military strategy. Let's get into it. To understand how Khalid broke Roman fortresses, we first need to understand what those fortresses actually were and why everyone, including the Romans themselves, believed they were essentially unbreakable under normal circumstances. The late Roman and Byzantine military tradition was built on a very specific philosophy of defense. The idea was simple. You fortify key cities and positions, you garrison them with trained soldiers and enough supplies, and you force any invader to either spend months trying to crack you open or leave you behind and deal with the threat at their rear. This strategy had worked for centuries. It worked because siege warfare was expensive, time-consuming, and required resources that not every army had. You needed wood for siege towers. You needed engineers who understood how to build and operate these machines. You needed the logistical tail to support a long siege, and you needed patience. The cities of Syria and the Levant that Khalid would eventually campaign through were not just walled towns. These were serious military fortifications. Cities like Damascus had walls that had been reinforced and rebuilt over generations. Bosra, which would become one of Khalid's most important targets, was a provincial capital with strong walls and a garrison that knew its business. Emesa, which we know today as Homs, was another heavily fortified position. These weren't places you could walk up to and knock on the door, and the Romans knew their own system's strengths. If you wanted to take one of these cities, the conventional playbook said you surrounded it, you cut off its supply lines, you brought up your siege equipment, and you waited. The city would eventually fall from starvation, from the mechanical battering of your machines, or from a breach in the walls. That was how it was done. That was how it had always been done. So why didn't Khalid do it that way? And more importantly, how did he manage to take these cities without doing it that way? The answer starts not with Khalid the general, but with Khalid the student of human nature. Because more than any engineer or tactician, Khalid understood something that most commanders of his era either didn't grasp or chose to ignore. A fortress is only as strong as the will of the people inside it to keep defending it. Stone walls don't fight. People fight, and people can be made to doubt, to fear, to negotiate, and ultimately to open their gates if you know exactly what levers to pull. Let's talk about the campaign in Syria, because that's where we really see this in action. By the time Khalid arrived in Syria in the year 634, he had already pulled off what might be the single most extraordinary military march in the ancient world. He had crossed the Syrian desert from Iraq a route that most military commanders considered essentially impassable for a large force. No army was supposed to be able to make that crossing quickly because water was the problem. You run out of water in the Syrian desert and your army dies. It's that simple. Khalid solved the water problem in a way that was typically brilliant and typically brutal in its simplicity. He had camels not just as pack animals, but as living water reserves. Before the march, he restricted the camels from drinking, letting them build up reserves in their bodies. Then, during the crossing, when his men needed water, he slaughtered the camels and retrieved the water stored in their stomachs. It was gruesome, and it was effective. He crossed the desert in a matter of days when it should have taken weeks, if it was possible at all. Why does this matter for understanding the fortress strategy? Because it tells you the kind of commander Khalid was. He did not accept the premise that something was impossible just because everyone said it was impossible. He looked at the obstacle, he found the hidden variable that other people had ignored, and he solved the problem from an angle nobody expected. That is exactly what he would do again and again with these fortified cities. When Khalid's army emerged from the desert and began operations in Syria, the Roman and Byzantine forces were already dealing with multiple Muslim armies operating in the region. Khalid's arrival essentially unified the command and changed the strategic dynamic completely. And one of the first major tests came at the city of Bosra. Bosra was the capital of the Roman province of Arabia. It had walls, it had a garrison, it had everything a fortified city was supposed to have. By conventional logic, Khalid should have settled in for a siege. Instead, what he did was apply pressure in a way that made the defenders feel like the walls were irrelevant. The key was psychological warfare delivered through military demonstration. Khalid didn't just camp outside the city and wait. He kept his army in constant motion. He raided the surrounding countryside, cutting off any possibility of the garrison receiving reinforcements or resupply from outside. He made sure that everyone in Bosra could see that his army was not going away, was not getting weaker, and was not going to be defeated by simply waiting it out. At the same time, he offered terms, generous terms. If the city surrendered, the lives and property of the inhabitants would be protected. No massacre, no looting, no enslavement. This was not just mercy, though Khalid was often more merciful in victory than his reputation might suggest. This was strategy. By offering real, credible terms to the people inside the fortress, he gave the defenders a choice that didn't require them to fight to the death. He made surrender feel rational rather than shameful, and it worked. Bosra fell through negotiation, not through siege engines. Now some people hear that and they think, okay, that's not really breaking a fortress without siege engines, that's just diplomacy. But that's exactly the wrong way to look at it. What Khalid understood is that military operations and psychological operations are not separate things. Every military move he made was also a psychological move. Every cavalry raid was not just about destroying supplies. It was about demonstrating to the garrison that they were isolated, that they were alone, and that help was not coming. Every generous offer of terms was not just humanitarian, it was a calculated strike at the garrison's will to resist. The fortress walls meant nothing if the people inside them believed that resistance was futile. Khalid's entire approach to fortified cities was designed to reach inside those walls and destroy the defenders' belief that they could hold out. But negotiation alone can't explain everything. Sometimes the defenders didn't want to negotiate. Sometimes they had too much pride or too much fear of what their superiors would say, or genuinely believed that relief was coming. And that's when we see the other side of Khalid's genius, his ability to manufacture military crises that made even the most determined defenders reconsider. Let's talk about Damascus, because Damascus is really where you see the full picture of how Khalid operated against a major fortified city. Damascus in 645 was one of the most important cities in the Roman East. It had massive walls, multiple heavily fortified gates, a substantial garrison, and enormous strategic value. If Khalid was going to demonstrate that the new power emerging from Arabia could take on and defeat the Roman imperial system, Damascus was the test. The city couldn't be easily starved out the short term. It had reserves and a substantial civilian population that knew how to manage them. It couldn't be stormed easily. The walls were too strong, and Khalid didn't have the siege equipment to create a breach. So what did he do? He did something that was so tactically audacious, it's almost hard to believe. He divided his forces. In conventional military thinking, dividing your forces in the presence of a fortified enemy garrison is the kind of mistake that ends careers and gets armies destroyed. The garrison could sortie out against one division while the other was too far away to respond. But Khalid wasn't dividing his forces out of desperation or miscalculation. He was dividing them deliberately, and he had placed his commanders with absolute care. He positioned forces at multiple gates of Damascus simultaneously. Each detachment was commanded by one of his most capable officers, and crucially, he positioned himself where he could move to support any of them. What this did was create a situation where the Damascus garrison couldn't focus its defense. Every gate was under threat. Every commander inside the city had to hold his position because if he moved his men to reinforce another gate, the gate he abandoned might fall. Meanwhile, Khalid was managing the surrounding environment with his typical ruthlessness. Roman relief columns were coming. A Byzantine force was marching to relieve Damascus, and this is where something remarkable happened. Khalid essentially fought a field battle and a siege simultaneously, keeping his forces tight enough around the city that the garrison couldn't break out to link up with the relief column, while also having the mobility to intercept the relief force before it arrived. When he defeated the relief force at the Battle of Yarmouk, the psychological impact inside Damascus was devastating. The message was unmistakable. Your walls cannot save you, your reinforcements cannot reach you, and we are not leaving. The city fell shortly afterward, with some gates reportedly opening through negotiation, while others were taken by direct assault, with scaling ladders, not siege engines. And here is a point worth pausing on, because it reveals something important about how Khalid thought about walls. He didn't ignore the physical challenge of walls. He reframed it. A wall that you can't breach with machines can still be climbed if the defenders are distracted, demoralized, or focused elsewhere. The art was to create enough simultaneous pressure at enough points that the defenders couldn't be everywhere at once. This is what military historians sometimes call the economy of force problem, and Khalid weaponized it brilliantly. A garrison defending a wall needs every man at his post. The moment you create a genuine threat at multiple points simultaneously, the garrison commander faces an impossible choice: thin out his defenses to cover everything, or concentrate and leave somewhere unguarded. Khalid's assault tactics were designed to make that choice, agonizing and ultimately fatal for the defense. It's also worth talking about something that almost never gets mentioned in the popular accounts of these campaigns, which is Khalid's intelligence operation. He was not marching blind into these sieges. He gathered information aggressively. Local populations, many of whom had complex relationships with Roman imperial authority and were not necessarily loyal to the garrison, often provided him with information about the state of defenses, the strength of garrisons, the location of water supplies, and the political situation inside the city. Khalid used this intelligence with surgical precision. He knew which cities were likely to crack under pressure and which ones would require a different approach. He knew which commanders inside cities might be open to negotiation and which ones would need to be defeated militarily before their subordinates would consider surrendering. This human intelligence network was as important to his success as any battlefield maneuver. Now let's talk about something that's even more interesting: the times when Khalid's forces actually did have to fight their way over or through walls, and how they did it without conventional siege engines. The answer, in part, was the assault column. Khalid's infantry were equipped with scaling ladders and trained to move fast under cover of arrow fire. The idea was not to slug it out with the defenders in a slow, grinding siege, but to create a moment, just a moment, of vulnerability in the defense, and exploit it instantly before the defenders could recover. This required extraordinary timing and coordination. The archers had to suppress the defenders on the walls long enough for the assault troops to get their ladders up and begin climbing. The assault troops had to move with speed and courage that went beyond ordinary battlefield bravery, because climbing a ladder toward defenders who are actively trying to kill you is one of the most dangerous things a soldier can do, and the commanders had to read the battle in real time, identifying where the defense was weakening and feeding their best men into that gap. What made Khalid's army capable of this was not just training, but the intense unit cohesion and individual motivation that characterized the early Muslim armies. These were men who believed deeply in what they were fighting for. That belief doesn't replace training or tactical skill, but it does mean that soldiers are willing to do things that purely mercenary or conscripted troops would refuse. When Khalid needed men to charge a wall under fire, he had men who would do it, and who would keep doing it even when the man in front of them fell. The battle for Emesa, modern-day Homs, showed another dimension of Khalid's approach. By the time he turned his attention to Emesa, his reputation was already working as a weapon. Cities that had heard what happened to Damascus, what happened to Bosra, what happened to the relief columns that tried to save them, were already negotiating from a position of fear and isolation rather than confidence. The accumulated psychological weight of his campaign was doing work before he even arrived. Khalid also had a genius for timing that is hard to fully appreciate unless you look at the strategic map of his entire campaign. He didn't just take cities, one by one, in a straight line. He moved in ways that constantly shifted the strategic situation, cutting off cities from each other, defeating relief forces before they could link up, and creating the impression, which was not entirely wrong, that he was everywhere at once. This was partly his cavalry doctrine, which we need to talk about, because it was absolutely central to everything. Khalid's cavalry were probably the finest operational cavalry force of their era, not because they had better horses or better equipment than the Romans. In many respects, the Romans and Byzantines had the superior material, but because of how Khalid used them. He used his cavalry not as a shock force to win pitched battles, though they did that too, but as a strategic mobility tool that gave him options that no army equipped with slow-moving siege engines could have. Cavalry could move faster than news. Cavalry could appear at a place that the enemy thought was safe. Cavalry could raid deep into the enemy rear, destroying supplies and communication lines. Cavalry could screen a city so effectively that defenders literally didn't know what was happening outside their wall, and hulls and cavalry could run down a retreating garrison if the defenders ever tried to break out and escape. What this meant for fortress warfare was that Khalid's investment of a city was never static. It was dynamic, aggressive, and, from the defender's perspective, terrifying in its unpredictability. You never knew if the cavalry screen around you was about to be reinforced, if a relief column had already been ambushed somewhere on the road, or if Khalid himself was about to appear at your weakest gate with his best troops. The uncertainty was itself a weapon. A garrison that doesn't know what's happening outside its walls is a garrison that is constantly catastrophizing, constantly imagining the worst. Morale doesn't erode in a straight line. It erodes in sudden collapses, in moments when reality finally matches the worst fears that had been building for weeks. Khalid was expert at engineering those collapse moments. There's another element of Khalid's fortress strategy that often gets overlooked, and that's his management of the civilian population. In most of the cities he besieged, there was a significant civilian population alongside the military garrison. These civilians were not necessarily loyal to Rome or to the Byzantine administration. Many were Aramaic-speaking Christians, Jews, or members of religious communities that had experienced real tension with imperial religious policy in the years before the invasion. Khalid's treatment of surrendered populations was, by the standards of 7th century warfare, notably restrained. He consistently honored his agreements, When he said your lives and property would be protected if you surrendered, he meant it and enforced it within his own ranks. This was not just morality, though there was genuine moral principle involved. It was also strategy of the highest order. When word spread that Khalid honored high terms, it changed the calculation inside cities that hadn't yet surrendered. The choice for defenders was no longer between fighting for survival and giving up. It became a choice between an indefinite, costly, ultimately probably losing defense and a negotiated surrender that preserved everything that mattered. For many garrison commanders and city populations, that was not a hard choice once they accepted that relief was not coming. This points to something profound about what Khalid was actually doing with his entire strategy. He was not trying to physically destroy Roman fortresses. He was trying to make those fortresses irrelevant. A fortress is only a fortress if it provides a credible basis for hope. If the defenders believe that holding out will eventually lead to relief, to survival, to victory, they will endure enormous suffering to keep holding. But the moment that hope is gone, the moment they genuinely believe that the walls cannot save them, the fortress is already fallen. The physical breach comes later as a formality. Khalid's entire campaign was an extended operation in hope destruction. Every relief column defeated was a nail in the coffin of hope. Every city that fell through negotiation was a demonstration to the next city that this was possible, survivable, that it wasn't a death sentence. Every cavalry raid was a message. We are not weakening, we are not leaving, and you are not leaving, and you are more alone than you were yesterday. It's worth stepping back and asking, was Khalid unique in this kind of thinking, or was he drawing on existing traditions? The honest answer is both. The principle that psychological pressure is as important as physical force in siege warfare was not new. The Romans themselves had used it. Various commanders throughout history had used the strategic isolation of besieged cities as a primary weapon. What was unusual about Khalid was the combination, the speed of movement that allowed strategic isolation while also allowing offensive operations, the credibility of his offers of terms, the quality of his cavalry for maintaining pressure without being vulnerable to a sortie, and the charismatic authority he had over his own forces that allowed him to ask extraordinary things of them and receive extraordinary things in return. He was also operating in a specific historical moment that gave him structural advantages. The Byzantine Empire in the 630s was exhausted. It had just finished a catastrophic war against the Sassanid Persian Empire, a war that lasted for decades and left both superpowers bled white. The manpower, the treasury, the logistical systems that would have been needed to mount a proper, sustained defense of Syria were simply not available in the way they had been a generation earlier. The relief columns that Khalid kept defeating were not the Roman legions of their finest hour. They were the remnants of a system struggling to reconstitute itself after near-total collapse. This doesn't diminish Khalid's achievement. You fight the army in front of you, not the theoretical best army your enemy could field, but it does provide essential context for understanding why his method worked so consistently. He was applying maximum pressure to a system that was already under enormous stress, and the fortresses that fell so dramatically to his combined psychological and military approach were not at full strength in the way the same fortresses might have been 50 years earlier. The culmination of this entire strategy came at the Battle of Yarmouk in 636, which wasn't a fortress battle at all. It was a field battle where the Byzantine Empire tried to reverse everything Khalid had done, and here too Khalid's tactical genius was on full display. But the connection to the fortress campaign is this: by the time Yarmouk was fought, the Byzantine system in Syria was already broken. Most of the fortified cities that should have been anchors of Byzantine resistance had already fallen. The fortresses that remained were isolated, demoralized, and waiting to see what happened. When the Byzantine field army was destroyed at Yarmouk, the remaining fortresses essentially lost the last thing they were waiting for: the possibility that a Roman military victory in the field would change the strategic equation. They didn't. After Yarmouk, city after city opened its gates, not because Khalid had suddenly acquired siege engines, but because the hope that had been keeping defenders at their posts was finally, definitively gone. So what do we take away from all of this? What is the lesson that Khalid ibn al-Walid teaches us about what it actually takes to break a fortress? The lesson is that the fortress in your enemy's mind is the only one that truly matters. Stone and mortar and thick walls are real things. They impose real costs on any attacker, but they don't decide battles on their own. They give the people inside them the ability to resist if, and only if, those people believe resistance is worthwhile. Khalid's entire method was aimed at systematically, relentlessly, and brilliantly destroying that belief, while simultaneously demonstrating through action that he could not be stopped. He was a student of human behavior, as much as he was a student of warfare. He understood that armies are not machines. They're collections of human beings with fears and hopes and breaking points. And he found those breaking points with the precision of a surgeon and the relentlessness of a force of nature. There is something almost modern about his approach. When you strip away the 7th century context, what Khalid was doing would be recognized by any serious student of military strategy today as information operations, psychological operations, strategic isolation, combined arms pressure, and economy of force, all integrated seamlessly into a campaign that moved faster than his enemies could adapt to. He didn't need siege engines, because he understood that the real target was never the wall. It was the man standing behind the wall, deciding whether today was the day to keep fighting or the day to negotiate. And Khalid knew with a certainty that came from hard experience and genuine military genius how to make that man choose to open the gate. That is how Khalid ibn al-Walid broke Roman fortresses without siege engines, not through brute force, not through magical tactics, but through a deep, almost intuitive understanding of how human beings behave under pressure, combined with the tactical and operational skill to create exactly the kind of pressure that would produce the outcome he needed. He was, without question, one of the most remarkable military minds in the history of the ancient world. And his campaigns in Syria, looking at them carefully as we've done today, reveal a commander who was not just reacting to circumstances, but actively shaping the psychological and military reality his enemies had to operate within. He didn't break fortresses, he made fortresses useless. And there's a difference between those two things that, once you see it, changes how you understand everything. If you made it this far, thank you, genuinely. This is the kind of story that deserves to be told in full, and I hope you felt like we really got into the detail today. If you want to go deeper, I'd love to hear in the comments what aspect of Khalid's campaigns you want us to cover next. There's so much more story here. The Battle of Yarmouk alone could fill its own video, and frankly it deserves one. Hit the like button if this gave you something to think about. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next one.